Hi everybody, John Bailey here, gemstone artist and founder of the International Faceting Academy. Welcome back to our studio and to another video on the art and science of faceting precious gemstones. There's a question that we see online on a regular basis, and I'm seeing it a lot lately, and it's about finding the cleavage plane on Topaz faceting rough, and particularly these little river-worn rounded pieces where there's nothing obvious, at least until you know what you're looking for, to help you know how to orient the stone. We might ask the question, orient the stone, why? Why do we care? What if we don't? What if we just have a piece of topaz rough and we just dop it and cut it? And the answer is you might wind up with a facet on your design on or very close to the cleavage plane. So what? What if that happens? You might have a huge headache in your polishing. You might have lots of frustration, lots of wasted time, lots of aggravation. And in the process, while you continue to try to work that facet, the facet's moving and it's blowing up the meats. And so it's just a huge amount of time suck and frustration that might be unnecessary if you orient the stone in the first place. So what else? One of the other reasons that we'd like to be able to spot cleavage planes is that they're diagnostic for identification purposes. And we'd like to be able to pick out the topaz that somehow might have found its way into a parcel of aquamarine, because I don't want to pay aquamarine prices for topaz or buy topaz when I think I'm buying aquamarine. So by the time we're done with the video, you'll be more prepared to find the cleavage on topaz rough, and your site ID of topaz should get a big boost in the process, which can help protect you from potential losses when identification might be in question. Pay attention all the way through this video, because later I'm going to share 4 things that you can do to up-level your skills in rough evaluation, and particularly about topaz. Now I'm going to show a number of rough specimens, beginning with crystals, with terminations, and growth lines, and all kinds of clues to orient us to the crystal growth direction, and that'll put us wise to where the cleavage plane is. Then we're going to move on to some river-worn pieces with some cleavage areas on them, and finally we're going to go to river-worn pieces and tumbled specimens like this one, where we're going to have to use some other methods for orienting. Let's take a look. Before we look at rocks, let's talk about what is cleavage and why do we care? To understand that, let's take a deck of cards. Let's imagine that this is a crystal and that the growth direction is vertical. A crystal is a stack of layers of molecules that are bound together by chemical bonds. Each of these cards could represent 1 molecule thickness of material. And they don't have a lot of glue in this particular direction. They're not especially strong in that direction. Altogether, a stack of cards is actually very strong in this direction. People have been shot with these in their pocket and it stopped a bullet. So very strong in this direction. Just not a lot of glue in the molecular bonds in our crystal in this direction. This is what perfect cleavage means, because when the bonds start to give up across the crystal, it's like cutting a deck of cards, and the bond gives up straight all the way across the crystal, and we tend to get a single flat perfect plane. What happens when we want to facet one of these crystal structures? We can bring a tool in to try to cut through our crystal, our stack of cards, and if our tool travels down through the deck across these weak bonds, it's going to be able to cut through. If we put enough force on this pocket knife, it would just cut through. And we could even get it to cut at somewhat of an angle if we could hold everything together and make the right amount of force. But the more our direction of force through this stack of cards comes close to the cleavage plane, the plane of weak molecular bond, the more we're likely to start unstacking the deck of cards. And that's where, on a stone with cleavage, we might find, on the rough, we might find this sort of terraced effect that we're going to see soon when we're looking at actual stones. This is what that looks like in an actual stone. This is a topaz where we're pre-polishing the table facet on the cleavage plane. And these little areas show where it's actually sliding and coming apart in the same way that our deck of cards did. Here we have a topaz crystal looking at the prism sides of it. This is the termination. And we might take note of that shape, because when we're looking at topaz, quite often we want to look for this termination shape, because that's a big clue about where the cleavage might be. The cleavage in topaz is straight across the crystal, straight across this direction, across the crystal. We can see the cleavage here in this really shiny fracture, shiny and flat. And that's what you're looking for to find the cleavage in topaz. So if you have a piece and you can't see the long prism face or the striations here on the growth direction, if you look closely in the reflection, you can see striations lengthwise here, direction of growth. It's more obvious on this prism face. So if we have a broken piece and all we have is this, we can see these growth lines lengthwise. That'll give us a clue the direction of the C-axis, the growth axis. Our cleavage is across the growth axis. Multiple shiny areas parallel to each other, like these ones down here and this one here. Multiple shiny areas. They don't have to be a great big flat spot like this, but we want to tune the eye into as I roll this and it creates glare off the lamp. If we look at the entire base of the crystal, we'll notice not just this large face here flashing glare, we notice this little spot right here flashes glare at the same time because it's parallel. We'll notice these small flat zones here and this little stair-stepping zone right here. Notice that they all flash light at the same time, showing that they're all parallel faces. A bunch of little tiny parallel faces, that's a clue to the cleavage plane. And in topaz, it's one direction, straight across the crystal. So once you find it, you've found it. We can find shorter crystals like this with a different shaped termination. This is the termination of the topaz crystal. So we're looking down the C-axis here. Looking on the prism faces, again we see the striations of growth. These parallel lines right here. This indicates C-axis in this direction. So the end of that, or where the sharp point of my pointer is, that should be the cleavage plane. And when we roll it to that position, what do we see? A whole bunch of shiny, flat surfaces that light up all at the same time because they're parallel to each other. One of the things we see right here, and this is another big clue in looking for cleavage planes in any material, is this iridescence. That's an open cleavage plane slightly inside the stone. It's right here. It's not very deep. But a cleavage plane that's open will flash that iridescence. Every iridescence is not necessarily a cleavage plane. It could just be a fracture. In this case, we notice that the iridescence lights up at the same time, in the same orientation to the light, as all of these flat surfaces, all flashing at the same time, all reflecting light at the same time, like a bunch of little tiny mirrors. When we see that, it's a pretty good bet. This is a cleavage plane inside the stone. Here's another one. Here's our prism view of the crystal. Here's some of our growth lines. And the cleavage planes parallel to each other. Here's our termination. So opposite this should be our cleavage plane. What are our other clues? Not a whole bunch. We don't want to mistake this effect for cleavage plane. There's one cleavage plane in Topaz. This is it. These flat surfaces are perpendicular to the actual cleavage plane. So we do want to be careful, and we do want to double check and make sure we're not getting fooled. This is super obvious as an actual cleavage. This is just a little bit of a shiny area. This is the actual termination here. These two sides. We believe this sharp edge right here is the termination. These are the two sides of it. So we should be able to go perpendicular to that, and right along here we should find a collection of little flat surfaces that are all optically parallel, and you see them all flashing. Where that flash comes, that's our cleavage plane. Here's another piece. This is really obvious. It's a dead giveaway, with all of these large flat areas and this iridescence lighting up right here. Really obvious. A lot of pieces of topaz will have this tumbled effect, and you may find they've been broken along the cleavage. So this makes it really obvious. If we didn't have this, we might notice these flat surfaces down here that are parallel and reflective. With this, we see them together. If we flip this over, this plane, you can see that this is a little bit flattish here from being broken. This is more worn, but when we turn it, here's our shiny parallel mirrors. Here's some of our terracing effect under a loop. You can see the little steps. For scale, this pointer is a sewing needle. Here's our iridescence. Quite often you'll get a parallel surface like this with a deck of cards terracing up to another surface. Sometimes just a small amount of this sort of edge of a deck of cards or a ream of paper effect is what you'll see. Sometimes there's just a small patch of that showing. If you have one that's not really obvious, you can just roll it around in the light, and you might find an area of the stone that sort of flashes. This is an almost moonstone-ish effect, and there's an iridescence here, this little giveaway, but if I cover that iridescence and just roll this across here, you see this little moonstone-like effect, this little moonstone-like flash? That's all from the surface, and it's because there are lots and lots of little tiny exposures of those parallel mirrors. So this portion of the stone doesn't have that effect, and it's very specific, right? Just a little bit off and we lose the effect. That little moonstone-like flash, we know that we're looking at a cleavage plane, and this iridescence right here is a real giveaway. There's a piece of cleavage that's open here. There's a little corner right here that's open. So we should be able to flip that 180 and find the same effect on the far side. Very obvious. All you need is a single light source and just a little patience. You can see a little mirror here and some little ones here that are definite, but the entire surface gives a moonstone-like effect. Here's another example of this moonstone-like effect. where you roll part of the crystal across and it flashes. This is just because there are lots and lots of tiny pieces of cleavage plane exposed, and they're all flashing at the same time because they're parallel. So this moonstone-like effect is a clue to finding the cleavage plane. Where are we opposite that? Somewhere over here, and there it is. There's our effect. And some slightly larger parts of that cleavage. Here's a real oddly shaped piece. Those shiny areas are not cleavage. That's a prism left over from the prism surface on the original growth. These lines right here are actually growth lines. Here's our cleavage plane. Parallels, terraces. And aside from the large shiny areas, here's our little flashing. If we just look at this region here, here's that almost moonstone-like flash from lots and lots of tiny parallel surfaces. Here it is on the other end. These guys are a little shiny, but they're not parallel. They don't light up exactly the same, and none of this area, rough area in between, is showing the moonstone effect. Here the entire area is lighting up, even the rough portions. This one's interesting. This looks like maybe this is the C-axis. Here's some interesting flashing areas. They're definitely not a cleavage plane. They're not real flat. We don't have nice terracing. They're kind of scooped out looking. See that curvature of that? That's not flat. So we might expect, just because the piece is longer this way, we might expect maybe that's the C-axis. Let's look at the end. There's no little moonstone-like flash, and the shiny spots that are here, definitely not flat and parallel. What about the other end? Not really. What about this? Pretty obviously, that's the cleavage plane. Big, flat, parallel terraces, a little iridescent where part of it's open, and then parallel to that, more flats. This little terracing right here, and they're all parallel. They all light up at the same time. So this is actually the C-axis of the crystal, looking down through this way, through here. When we look at it in this direction, here's our flat, here's our flat. So the direction may not always be obvious. The crystal may be fractured up in a really odd way. This is the lengthwise of the crystal growth.
Now you can find the cleavage. What do you do with that information? Most books say to orient the table of a topaz gemstone 10 degrees off of the cleavage plane. And that opens up a few questions. The first question is that right? The answer is mostly, and especially for beginners. I cover some of the why of this in the companion video to this one, and it's available on the Faceting Academy website. I'll put a link to that video in the description below this one. The next question is that the way we should always do it? Should we always be 10 degrees off the cleavage plane? The answer is no, not always, and there are a number of reasons why we might do it differently. I will cover some of the why and what to do instead in that companion video that I just mentioned. Also, what's an easy way to get that 10-degree tilt? Because as a beginner, the tendency is to over tilt the stone. Certainly that's what I did. I was afraid of getting the table on the cleavage plane. The more experienced faceters had really frightened me about that, and I thought it would ruin the stone, or it would be impossible for me to finish it. So I over tilted the rough, and in that process I wind up with a star facet, one of the 17 or 20 or 22 degree star facets on the crown falling on the cleavage plane. And then that's right up next to the table, and so when the meats got blown up, that was a serious headache. So in the companion video that I just mentioned, I'm going to show one easy way to make sure you're hitting that 10-degree tilt and not over tilting it. Earlier, I promised to give you 4 things to up-level your skills in this area. Here they are. The first thing is experiment. If you have any Topaz rough of your own, get it out. Start looking for all the features from the video. Consider re-watching the video and comparing the features in the video to the features of the rough that you own. Second, explore. Bookmark this video, and the next time you're getting ready to head to a show, watch the video again to refresh your memory. Then when you get to the show, find a bin of Topaz rough and go through it. Sort through it and find the cleavage on all the stones there. You can do this without buying anything, although it might be nice to buy something from the dealer who's letting you train on his bin full of rough. Third, ask questions. We learn best when we follow our curiosity. So if you have questions about this or anything else, leave those questions in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer so you can chase your curiosity into your future success. Fourth, the best way to be successful in faceting is to keep learning, with more free instruction at facetingacademy.com. You can also join the Faceting Academy, level up and get premium content. And if you're really serious, register for one of our exclusive live training events. While you're on the site, you can shop for faceting machines, accessories, polish, supplies, and even faceting rough. Now, if you like the video, please give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you want to see more like this, subscribe and hit the bell to make sure you don't miss any of our new content. I look forward to seeing you in the questions and comments below and on the Faceting Academy website. Until then, good meets.